If you take notes, conflict number one is Ishmael and Isaac, simply between the two brothers. Look in verses 8 and 9. It says this, "And the child grew," that's Isaac, "and he was weaned. And Abraham made a great feast that same day that Isaac was weaned. And Sarah saw the son of Hagar," that's Ishmael, "the Egyptian, which she had borne unto Abraham, mocking." She saw Ishmael mocking her son. So we see here the first conflict is between the two boys, between Ishmael and this little baby Isaac. It says that he was weaned. That means that his mother was no longer nursing him. This was before there was Gerber baby food and some of the stuff we have today. And in fact, I don't know how long it's been since you've had a little child in the house, but they're always coming out with new stuff. In fact, some of the stuff we have today, you probably would have loved to have had maybe when your children were younger. I mean, like these little puff snacks. Have you seen those? Where they put them in their mouth and they dissolve. It's like this little food the babies can eat, and it's impossible to choke on it. And, I see some older folks or grandparents stuff say, man, my kids never had stuff like that. We have all these things that make it a little bit easier these days to feed them baby food where they can get their fruits and vegetables. But they didn't have that in those days, and so it was very, very common for a mother to nurse her child until he was 2, sometimes even as much as 3 years old, because that was one of the main ways that they had to take care of their children. And so it was also commonplace that when a mother was done nursing her child, when the child was weaned from that, they would throw a feast. This was one of the milestone celebrations in a child's life. It's, all right, the child is weaned, let's throw a big feast, let's invite all of our friends and family, and that's what Abraham is doing. This was a custom. So when Isaac is no longer nursing from his mother, Abraham has this big feast. Now, we know that Abraham is extremely wealthy. We also believe that Abraham was kind of like a tribal ruler where he was, like a chieftain. He had so much influence. So many people knew Abraham. He was making covenants and contracts with people from other world leaders. So this party might have been like the party of the year. Like sometimes these Hollywood actors throw like this big bash, and that's like the party to go to. This might have been like the baby weaning party to attend. Like everybody who's everybody is at Abraham's party here for Isaac. He has all kinds of money, all kinds of friends and family. And so he throws this feast. I can just imagine this being like a big to-do, all these people there, and Ishmael is not enjoying himself at the party. It says he's mocking his little brother. Now, it takes a lot to mock a 2-year-old, right? I mean, you ever make fun of a toddler? That's pretty low. We make jokes about TJ sometimes, but we don't mock him. We talk about like, oh, he's all boy, but we don't make fun of him. We don't mock him, but that's what Ishmael is doing. Ishmael is mocking this 2 or 3-year-old little boy. We don't know what he said, but I mean, just kind of imagine the situation like he's saying, oh yeah, I mean, great, all these people are coming to watch this little boy. Great, he doesn't nurse anymore. That's all this for a kid who's no longer nursing. We don't know what he said, but he's mocking his little brother, mocking the situation. The Bible doesn't tell us whether or not Ishmael had such a party when he was weaned. It's the custom he may well have. Abraham loved his son, but we don't know that maybe if he did, maybe he didn't have quite the guest list that Isaac's party may have had. Ishmael is 17 years old at this point. So it's not like he was a little kid. He's 17, and he's mocking his little brother. So we see this conflict between the brothers. Now, I'm sure there's not a lot of only children here, people with siblings. You understand a little sibling rivalry, especially between boys, and I'm looking over here. Yeah, Patrick, yeah, we do. And I have a brother who's 11 months older than me. I get sibling rivalry, but 17 and maybe 2 or 3, there shouldn't be much of a rivalry there. Shouldn't be mocking his little brother there. And so we see this conflict between the two. This conflict continues still today. This conflict between Isaac and Ishmael is just as real today as it was on this day when Ishmael mocked his little brother. See, Ishmael became the father of what we refer to as the Arab race. Eventually, he would relocate to the area that we know of today as the Arabian Peninsula. His descendants became the Arabs. And Isaac's descendants, through his son Jacob and Jacob's son Joseph and on down the line, the father of Israel, the Jews. So the conflict we have today between Jews and Arabs, it originates right here when Ishmael mocks his little brother. And the conflict still goes on. You turn on the news, when they're not talking about Trump and Hillary, when you get past that, there's going to be some kind of conflict in the Middle East, right? There is always conflict in the Middle East. There has never not been conflict in the Middle East. As long as there have been Jews and Arabs, there has been conflict. And it goes back to this passage. There's no real explanation for it. You know, people try to say, you know, well, they started it, or it's been going on for centuries. Nobody knows who did what, except we know that Ishmael mocked Isaac, and it's gone on ever since. These two tribes, these two people groups have been in constant conflict, and it still continues today. The next conflict we see, conflict number two is Sarah and Hagar and Ishmael. Look at verse 10. It says, nope, wrong chapter. It says, wherefore she, Sarah, said to Abraham, cast out this bondwoman and her son, for the son of this bondwoman shall not be heir with my son, not Isaac. Now she can't call this bondwoman by name. She can't call this bondwoman's son by name. Didn't slip her mind. She knew it was Hagar. She knew it was Ishmael, but she's not even going to speak their name. We're meeting Sarah in a new role here tonight. This is now Mama Bear, Sarah. We've been following Sarah for a long time. This is first-time mom here. After all these years, she's 90, maybe 93, maybe 94 years old, and now she is Mama Bear. She's put up with Hagar for a long time. She's put up with Ishmael for a long time and all the weirdness that caused. But now, this bondwoman's son, he's mocking my little boy. This is Mama Bear Sarah, and she's saying, Abraham, it ain't going to happen. He is not going to mess with my little Isaac. Now, I'm sure she loved Ishmael and helped take care of Ishmael and allowed Abraham to take care of Ishmael, but here she draws the line. My little boy is not going to be mocked and ridiculed by that other woman and her son. And so we see this conflict now beginning to arise, and we realize these two ladies, Hagar and Sarah, can no longer coexist in the same house. She didn't want her son to share the inheritance that they were going to leave to Isaac. In those days, it was customary that the father would, if he thought he was about to die, he would let his children know who got what. But the firstborn always got a double portion of everything. So in a case like this, when you have two sons, the firstborn would get 2/3 of the inheritance, and Isaac would get 1/3 of the inheritance. Ishmael is in line to get twice as much as her little boy. She says, that bondwoman's son, he is not going to share in my son's inheritance. You're not giving him 2/3 of all that we have. He's not going to get any of it. She says, cast out this bondwoman. Kick Hagar out. I want her out of my house. I want her out of here. We see the next conflict, number 3. There's a conflict now between Sarah and Abraham. You know the expression, if mama's not happy, you know the rest of it. Nobody's happy. Sarah is not happy. And so Abraham is not in a position where he can say, all right, well, that's your business, and go on about his day. If Sarah's not happy, Abraham is not going to be happy until this conflict is resolved. So because Ishmael mocks Isaac, now Sarah's mad at Ishmael and Ishmael's mother Hagar, and because of all that, now she's mad at Abraham. And Abraham will not have peace until Sarah's happy. And the only way to make Sarah happy is to resolve all of these problems and all of this conflict. Look in verse 11. It says, the thing was very grievous in Abraham's sight because of his son. This is not what Abraham wanted. He didn't want to live like this. He didn't want his wife to be upset, and he loved his son Ishmael. We should never doubt that. Abraham loved both of his sons, but really he only had one wife. Hagar, despite their sin together, Hagar was not his wife. That was a one-night stand, in all honesty. He had one wife, and that was Sarah. So he's very upset because his wife is not happy. This conflict and all of this conflict between husband and wife, between brother and brother, between whatever you want to call Hagar and Sarah, all of this conflict is the result of sin. And we need to always remember that. Specifically, the relationship and the action between Abraham and Hagar. See, we live in a culture today that really tries to minimize promiscuity and sexual activity. Everybody's doing it. That's just the way things are. It's no big deal. And people say, look, this is guilt-free or this is harmless. And our society has really tried to downplay this. It's not a big deal. And it's assumed that by the time you're in your mid-20s maybe, that you will have been with 10 or 12 other people. That's just the way society said. That's just how things are. But notice all this conflict that comes up from a single action between Abraham and Hagar. The conflict in his own house, between the children, between his wife and Hagar, all stems from this one action. We must realize that. We can't accept that that's just the way things are. You might not hear as much about it. You might not see it on the TV shows that glamorize that lifestyle. And people that talk about it, you know, guys that brag about it, say, oh yeah, I've been with her and her and her. But what they don't realize is that the conflict is very real. The inner turmoil is real. The people that get left in a path of destruction, it's real. Families are torn apart because of it. There is no peace. There is no trust. This is real stuff. This conflict that's tearing apart this family goes back to a single act of infidelity in this married couple. We better be careful. We better not ever think that, it's no big deal. I hope you understand that all this conflict arises from one thing, from one act. We better not miss out on that. The fourth conflict now, though, is between Abraham and Hagar and Ishmael. Let's finish this passage. Or let's not, actually. Let's read verses 12 to 13. It says this, God said to Abraham, let it not be grievous in your sight because of the lad and because of the bondwoman. In all that Sarah has said to you, hearken unto her voice, for in Isaac your seed shall be called. And also the son of this bondwoman will I make a nation because of your seed. So Abraham rose up early in the morning, and he took bread and a bottle of water, and he gave it unto Hagar, putting it on her shoulder, and the child, and he sent her away. And she departed and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. This passage is hard for me to read. It's hard to think about this father getting up early in the morning, filling a water bottle, getting a loaf of bread, and giving it to Hagar and saying, take our son and go on. This is a hard passage. This is troubling. I'll admit, this is a difficult concept to grasp. This wasn't just Abraham saying, okay, Sarah, fine, just leave me alone. If I kick her out, will you get off my back? This is God saying, Abraham, listen to your wife. What she said to do, what Sarah says you need to do, send her out. Take the boy, your son, and send them on their way. And so this great hero, Abraham, gets a bottle of water and a loaf of bread, and he sends his son, and Hagar sends him off. That's tough. We see now the conflict between Abraham and Hagar and his own son Ishmael. Abraham hated it. He was grieved by it, but this was all his own doing. The action that he took with Hagar is what led to this. And he could no longer coexist. Two families, or whatever you want to call them, now living under one roof, they could no longer make it. The differences were irreconcilable. The only solution was for Hagar and Ishmael to leave. Now, there's a couple things we have to remember. First of all, Abraham did not abandon his son. Like we might think about a deadbeat dad, he walked out on his little kid. We have to realize that's not what happened here. He was obeying what God said to do, for one thing. God told him, it's okay, Abraham, let him go. But we also need to realize that God told Abraham that he was going to take care of Ishmael. Look, they could not go on living the way they were. Things were not going to be good between Isaac and Ishmael or between Sarah and Hagar. It was not going to work. And the only way was for them to part ways. So God said, I will still make your son a great nation. Isaac is the child of promise. Isaac is the one that I will fulfill my covenant with. But he said, because Ishmael is your seed, I will make him also a great nation. That's why we have the Arab race today and the Jewish race today through these two boys. But notice the underlying promise in there. If God is going to make of Ishmael a great nation, then that also means God's going to take care of Ishmael. God's saying send him on his way, but it's not like he's going to get attacked by wolves. It's not like he's going to starve to death. It's not like they're going to be poor and not make it. If God is going to fulfill this promise, he's going to take care of Ishmael. Abraham had to trust that, but he was learning to trust God along the way. God was keeping all of his promises, and Abraham was learning to trust. As much as he did not want to send his son away, God said, I'm going to take care of him. And God did just that. We also need to remember, though, that Ishmael is not a little boy. He is 17. And again, you might think, well, 17 is still a kid. In that culture, it's not. A child had their bar mitzvah when a young man celebrated the fact that he was no longer a little boy, but a man. At 13 years old, he was legally an adult. Ishmael had been an adult for 4 years. He was, by that culture's standards, he's a grown man. By 17, many people were married with a couple of children in that culture. So he was not sending a little kid out on his own. Ishmael was a grown man, and God allowed him to stay there until adulthood. We might think of 17-year-old boys today. No offense to you guys over here. Most 17-year-old boys today have never done a load of laundry or scrambled an egg. Most of them have never worked a part-time job. They come home from school and play video games while their parents do their laundry and cook for them and do the yard work. And I see some of y'all nodding your heads. We had to earn our keep when I was growing up. I had to cut the grass and wash the dishes. But we don't. We have so spoiled, I think, a generation. We say, well, they're just kids. We got to let them be kids. In this culture, at 17, you're a grown man. You've got a wife. You've got kids. You've got responsibility. You've got a trade and a job. And so we don't need to think about Ishmael as being this poor little boy that Abraham just sent to fend for himself. He's a grown man. And Ishmael's job is now to take care of his mother because he was an adult. But God said he'd take care of him. And notice what he does here as we conclude this portion of the scripture. Look in verse 15. It says, that water bottle that he was given, it says the water was spent in the bottle. It was empty. And Hagar cast the child under one of the shrubs. It used the word child, but that word child means actually young adult. We shouldn't think of a little kid. He was a grown man. She cast the child under one of the shrubs, and she went and she sat down over against him a good way off as if it were a bow shot. And she said, this is her prayer, do not let me see the death of my child. And she sat over against him, and she lifted up her voice, and she wept. And God heard the voice of the lad, of Ishmael. And the angel of God said to Hagar out of heaven, and said unto her, what ails you, Hagar? Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the child where he is. Arise, lift up the boy, and hold him in your hand, for I will make him a great nation. And God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. Somehow she missed it before, but God opened her eyes. So she went and she filled the bottle with water, and she gave him a drink. And God was with the boy, and he grew, and he dwelt in the wilderness, and he became an archer. And he dwelt in the wilderness of Paran. And his mother took him and found him a wife out of the land of Egypt. So Ishmael's going to be okay. They had this one little incident where the water was gone, and they were dying of thirst, so she thought, and she said, I can't watch my son die. So she goes off kind of far away from him, and she expects him to lay there and die. But God kept his promise. He had told Abraham he'd take care of him. Now he tells Hagar he'll take care of him, and he does just that. He grows up. He becomes an archer. An archer, by the way, can feed himself, right? You hunters know that, bow season being upon us. An archer, a hunter, somebody can always find food to eat, and he does that. He gets married, and he's able to take care of his mother. And that's where this passage ends, because last week we picked up in 22, and we saw the covenant with Abimelech. So we see these conflicts that arise between Ishmael and Isaac, between Sarah and Hagar, between Sarah and Abraham, between Abraham and Hagar. But I want to close tonight by looking at a final conflict, number 5, the conflict between law and grace. You say, well, where do you get that? Well, let's turn to Galatians chapter 4, and we'll be finished. I'll just spend a couple minutes here in Galatians 4. My bookmark was my bulletin. I forgot to put it back in there, so give me a second. All right. Some of y'all are still turning. In Galatians chapter 4, though, we're going to see how Paul once used these two sons of Abraham as an analogy for law and grace. I still see people turning, so I'm not going to rush. Galatians chapter 4, we're going to begin in verse 21. It says this, Galatians 4:21 says, "Tell me, you who desire to be under the law, do you not hear the law? For it is written that Abraham had two sons, the one by a bondmaid, and the other by a free woman. But he who was of the bondwoman, Ishmael, was born after the flesh. But he of the free woman, Isaac, was born by promise. Which things are an allegory, or he should say analogy. For these are the two covenants. The one from Mount Sinai, which is to bondage, which is from Hagar. For this Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia, and answers to Jerusalem, which now is, and that is in bondage with her children. But Jerusalem, which is above, is free, which is the mother of us all. For it is written," well, actually, let's skip that part. Verse 28, "Now we, brethren, we, as Isaac was, are the children of promise. But as then he that was born after the flesh, Ishmael, persecuted him that was born after the Spirit, he mocked him. Even so it is now. Nevertheless, what says the Scripture? Cast out the bondwoman and her son. For the son of the bondwoman shall not be heir with the son of the free woman. So then, brethren, we are not children of the bondwoman, but of the free woman." Paul's point is this. You either have one of the other when it comes to your mothers. They were both sons of Abraham. Your mother is either, analogically speaking, your mother is either Hagar or Ishmael. And he says, we, brethren, Christians, we are not children of Hagar. We are children of the free woman who was Sarah. He says, we do not identify as Ishmael, who was born under the law, but we identify with Isaac, who was born from the promise. The two sons are contrasted here on the basis of their mothers, not on their common father. Here's what Paul says in a nutshell. Hagar, the slave, had a son after the flesh, a sinful conception. Her act of conception with Abraham, which produced Ishmael, was sinful. Hagar sinned and had a son after the flesh. Sarah was free. She had a son by a miraculous promise in that she conceived in an old age and that she bared a child at 90 years old. So one a slave and one free. One had a child through an act of sin. One had a child through a miraculous promise from God. But here's where it gets most important. Hagar, he says, relates to Mount Sinai in Arabia. Now, that's where they went and settled. You know, they became the Ishmael, the father of the Arab race. But what happened at Mount Sinai? Somebody said it. What? Yeah, the law. Who said that? Thank you. The law was given. God gave Moses the law at Mount Sinai. Mount Sinai is forever associated with the giving of the law. The Ten Commandments, that whole old covenant was entered into at Mount Sinai. And Sarah, or Hagar and Ishmael, they relate to Mount Sinai. They correspond because that's where she went to live in Arabia. They now forever are tied in to the old covenant system of law and works. And then he even ties her in with, he says, present or modern day Jerusalem, modern day in Paul's day. What was in Jerusalem? The temple. It was the headquarters of the Jewish faith. So from Mount Sinai to Jerusalem was everything that was law and works. The law was given at Sinai, and the religion was carried out at the temple in Jerusalem. But Sarah, he says she corresponds to what he says the Jerusalem which is above, the higher Jerusalem. Now, they didn't really understand all that in Paul's day, but one day John would have a vision. And he says, I saw a new heaven and a new earth coming down from above. And he says, in that new earth was the holy city, New Jerusalem. It was believed in Paul's day that there was a city called Jerusalem up where God was in the realms of heaven. And so this Jerusalem will come down to earth. And he says Sarah represents the Jerusalem which is above. So one corresponds to the law and the works of Jerusalem, and the other corresponds to the New Jerusalem, which is the new covenant. So one is tied into a system of works, and she gave birth to a slave. And no matter what they did, they could never free themselves. Of course, ultimately, Abraham freed them. But you and I, if we choose to make ourselves under the law, we are enslaving ourselves. No matter how hard we work, we can never work enough. This is the problem with the law. We can never be good enough. And Paul says, listen, you who put yourselves under the law. Do you not know what the law says? If you think you can work your way to heaven, you will never have a sigh of relief. You will never take a breath where you relax. If you think you have to work your way to heaven, how good is good enough? You can never say, that's it, I hit my quota, I'm good enough, now I can relax, I'm going to heaven. If you put yourself under the law and say, I've got to work, I've got to work, I've got to work, you'll never work enough. You'll never relax. You'll never rest. But if you put yourself under grace, under what Jesus did on the cross, my work ended the minute I realized that Jesus did all he needed to do, more than I could ever do. I'm not under the law, I'm under grace. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't do good works. There's plenty of good works to do. But I don't do them to be right with God. I don't do them to be saved. I'm saved because I realize that Jesus Christ is the Savior, the one who saved me. I said, Father, I trust in you. I believe in you. Would you save me? And in that moment, my good works that I thought I had to do were done. The only work that can save us is to trust in Christ. Once you've done that, your works for salvation are satisfied. Now, we're saved to a life of good works. We should honor our parents. We should attend church. We should do the things we talked about this morning. We should be witnesses for Christ. We should do all these good things. Be honest, show love, do good works, but not to be saved. If we do that, we're putting ourselves back under the law. We're enslaving ourselves like Ishmael after his freedom. Why would he go back to the law? If we do those things, we're just like Hagar and Ishmael. Hagar and Ishmael represent the futility of trying to keep the law. Theirs is a system of legalism. But Sarah and Isaac, they to us represent the beauty of grace and lordship. Now, lordship means we still have to work, we still have to do good things, but we do it because we're saved by grace through faith. Only one son was the son of promise. Abraham was supposed to have one, but he had two because of his act of sin. Only one was the son of promise. That was Isaac. Ishmael